Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Huxley Speaker Series. My name is Stefan Freeland. I'm the host coordinator of the series, and today I also will be your guest speaker. As sometimes happens, sometimes we have to reschedule things, and so my apologies if you showed up expecting somebody else. But today we're going to talk about maps. I think everything's working. No one's throwing red flags on the floor, so let's jump right in. Okay, so the Salish Sea map. So my name is Stefan Freeland, as I said. When I'm not organizing the Huxley Speaker Series, I work as a GIS specialist, GIS analyst. I teach classes in GIS and GPS at Huxley College of the Environment. And it was my good fortune to get to make this map that was part of the Salish Sea name adoption process back a dozen years ago or so. So that's the topic for today. We're going to talk about maps and look at a bunch of other maps and then sort of some of the geography geeky stuff as well about why this map and some of the other possibilities. So I assume that most of you coming to a Huxley Speaker Series and a Salish Sea focused talk have a pretty good idea what the Salish Sea is. But just in case, we're talking about the inland marine waters of Washington and British Columbia, bounded by the Johnstone Strait to the north and Cape Flattery, the edge of the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the west, Olympia down there, and then Bellingham over there on the eastern shore of the Salish Sea. It also can be described by the constituent pieces. So you've got the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the Strait of Georgia, the Desolation Sound, the Puget Sound, and then the Gulf Islands and the San Juan Islands in the middle there. So kind of nicely straddles the border there with a pairing of straits and sounds and the island groupings. Lots of different pieces and lots of different people who call very attached to those names. And so in the naming process, that was important to preserve those names. And I'll talk about that more as we go along. So again, we're talking about the inland marine waters, though, the contained body of salt water, semi-fresh water, blending salt and seawater, held in by Vancouver Island and the Olympic Peninsula. Okay, so quickly just to run through some of the numbers. The Salish Sea has got 18,000 square kilometers of surface area, so big but not huge. It's notable in that we have some fairly steep terrain around there, rising up to over 4,000 meters for Mount Rainier, of course, and down to over 600 meters deep. There are hundreds of rivers, depending on how you define a river versus a creek versus what have you. 20 glaciers or so, again, depending on how you define a glacier. Hundreds, 400 plus islands or so, depending on how you define an island. And we'll get into some of those definitions as we go. But again, a varied, interesting place, as we all well know. In terms of species out there, we've got hundreds of species of fish and likewise birds, dozens of species of marine mammals, thousands of species of invertebrates, which is our insects and jellyfish and whatnot out there, and 2 species of reptiles, sea turtles. So there's a couple of them out there. The Sea Dock Society 2011 did a report looking at a lot of these species. By their calculation, we have over 100 of those species are at risk. That's the 2011. So those numbers are a little bit out of date, which is an opportunity for me to plug. There's a State of the Salish Sea report coming out in a couple of months. That's being produced by the Salish Sea Institute here on campus. And the lead author in that, Catherine Sobocinski, will be our guest speaker at Huxley Speaker Series 2 weeks from now. So we'll get an update of the more current numbers and the health of the Salish Sea in a couple of weeks. In addition to all that, from our standpoint, there's also a whole lot of people. I think it's over 8 million, pushing 9 million people now. Over half of those are down in the Puget Sound, Seattle area. That's where the big concentration of people, even though that's not the biggest area of the Salish Sea. But there's also 60 plus sovereign nations across on both sides of the border. Those people do a lot of stuff. And we've got major shipping terminals with lots of oil tankers coming in and out and lots of coal trains. Lots of noise those people produce. There's over 100 wastewater treatment discharge sites, so there's lots of wastewater those people produce, all of which have an impact on the Salish Sea, of course. And somewhat trying to manage all that impact is this dizzying array of jurisdictions. You've got both sides of the border. So you've got Canada and US and BC and WA. You've got all the various agencies underneath those, 4 headings. You've got Coast Guard and military and resources. You've got the ports of the individual cities and the counties, and then this host of nonprofits. So lots of, which is great. It's wonderful that we have so many people interested in the Salish Sea, and like I say, kind of a crazy making array of stakeholders at a meeting, and no single entity or jurisdiction that spans the whole of the Salish Sea, right? It's fragmented in lots of ways, including these jurisdictions, because of that international border. And it was that fragmentation of a lack of a name and a fragmentation of jurisdiction oversight that concerned Bert Weber. So Bert Weber, for those of you who don't know Bert was is a marine biologist. He was a faculty at Huxley College, studying estuaries and the like. He was born in Canada, so he had a trans-border nature in his life history as well. And he was concerned that there was a lack of awareness. From his standpoint, these inland waters was one estuarine ecosystem. And the treating them as the Strait of Juan de Fuca versus the Strait of Georgia versus Puget Sound made the need for overall strategies and management more difficult. And so he came up with this idea of the Salish Sea as a new name, and thought that would be a great idea. He proposed it to the Geographic Naming Board, and it was well received by a rather small subset of people, and otherwise had fairly little impact. Did not make the big splash he had hoped for, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Briefly, the word Salish, Bert's choice there, there's an obvious acknowledgement, tip of the hat to the indigenous peoples of the area. The word Salish is not a traditional Salish word, tribal indigenous word for this area. That was a name that was applied to a large group of a language group, all right, for indigenous speakers spanning from here into BC and over into Idaho, Montana. Again, somewhat fortuitously, an umbrella term for a lot of different peoples that had a similarity of language. That turned out to be, I think, fortuitous for a couple of ways. I mean, the alliteration of the Salish Sea is the nice, it rolls off the tongue. And so that was, I think, maybe as much as anything else what Bert was drawn to. But it was because it was not a tribal word per se. It wasn't, no single tribe had ownership over there. So it was a fair game as a word to use for a name. And it was also not affiliated with any one tribe. And so that kept anybody else from feeling left out. And yet, as I said, this very clear acknowledgement of the people who have lived here for time immemorial. So that worked out, I think, whether that was, just inspired choice or premeditated, it worked out very well. So there's a lot of Bert has given talks on campus, and was involved with the Salish Sea Institute on campus as well. There's a number of recordings and articles of his presentation of his history and his. So I don't that's Bert's story. I don't want to get too far into there, but I do want to acknowledge that those are out there, and I'll post these links in the event webpage for the Huxley Speaker Series. So if you want to get more of Bert's background, you're welcome to go look for that as well. So. Well, what Bert was up to, again, he was concerned about this estuary. So, what is an estuary? The first of many of these sort of what is questions I'll post today. It's basically an area where you have fresh water and salt water mixing. If you drain a river just straight into the Puget Sound, or into the Pacific Ocean, that water disperses into the salt water fairly quickly and, relatively speaking, small impact. But if that water is contained in an inland sea, such as the Salish Sea, in an estuary, you get a mixing of fresh and salt water that turns out to be very productive in terms of biology, and you get lots of birds and fish, and it's a great thing. We want to preserve those, we want to protect those, and Bert wanted to make sure that we didn't lose any more than we already had. Estuaries are by their nature vulnerable, because that same protectedness that keeps the water from just washing all away, that protects them and encloses them, makes them vulnerable to certain kinds of, especially toxins. And that was a lot of what Bert was most worried about. He also was aware that the estuaries were in decline. So this is a report from him a couple of years ago. and it's just looking at the state side. My apologies to the Canadian. I assume there's a similar, although probably not quite as severe loss there. So by their estimation, Washington has lost 85% of the once historical estuaries, leaving only 15%. And the bar charts on the right there are showing you it's not consistent. There are some watersheds that are actually have grown a little bit, have an increase of estuaries, but most of them, and around us in this part of the Sound, we're looking in the 30 to 60%. So a third to 2/3 of what was historic estuaries are gone. Estuaries are also, by their very nature and definition, they're lowland. And so if you have sea level rise as a factor coming in, that adds a whole new pressure on the estuaries. And it's unknown what that will do. That wasn't particularly on Bert's radar back in the 80s. As I said, his main concern was that we were bringing ships of oil, crude oil, down off Alaska. And the what if, his worst case scenario of one of those ships running aground. And in 1989, so a year after he had proposed that name, you had the Exxon Valdez spill, 10 million gallons, covering a huge swath of land and water up there. That area, which many miles. If you look at, so there's a similar a map of about the same scale for the Salish Sea. This was a report coming in 2019. Something of, they were estimating over 1,000 tankers of various chemicals and oils coming in every year, in and out. So there's that risk is real. And if you put that similar sized oil spill, if that happened, in the Salish Sea, those 10 million gallons would effectively cover every square inch of the Salish Sea. So a terrifying thought. Now, one of the things interesting about, if you look back to the Alaska map there, notice that Cook Inlet up there, Cook Inlet, did not receive much oil at all. All right. So even though the tides are extreme there, so you've got tides coming in and out of water rising and lowering, relatively small amount of oil went in. It went right past. And that illustrates some of that protective nature of an estuary, of that enclosed system, which is to say, if an oil spill happened out on the coast of Vancouver Island, it would not have that big of an impact on the Salish Sea. It'd be tragic. On the other hand, if you had an oil spill inside the Salish Sea, that same lack of flushing that makes an estuary, that makes it productive and rich, that's its vulnerability. That it would be virtually impossible to get that oil out of there for generations. This was Bert's fear. So again, as I said, he went about the process of applying to have a name, proposing a new name, and there's which brings up the question of how do names get applied or adopted, approved. So it turns out there's a geographic naming boards in BC and WA, Canada, US. There's 4 different governmental entities that have the vested power to approve names. And since the Salish Sea straddles those 4 jurisdictions, you ultimately would have to get the buy-in, the approval from all of those. But these boards have various, methodologies, but essentially they're all doing the same thing. And what they're trying to determine is, do the people, the locals, are people using this term? Is this a word that gets used on the street or on the water? And a similar process went on with Denali when the renaming, which is a very different process because it's a renaming of Mount McKinley. But it's a very grassroots. Denali was a different case because it was such a big mountain, and such a big deal, and it got very political. But for smaller things, rivers and seas and whatnot, it's an amazingly grassroots effort where they look to the people, and if the people are using the name, then they say, sure enough, it's a name. Now, there's also the process of the indigenous tribes and nations, and while they don't, in the current political system, have the same kind of say and buy-in, they should in many ways, and so it's actually even more complicated than just the 4 jurisdictions of the political boundaries. So the brief history is that 88, Bert proposes this idea, the Salish Sea. He submits a proposal. And in 89, it was denied by the Washington State Board of Geographic Names. They tabled the proposal rather than just out and out saying no. They tabled it. That was kind of good. They thought that it wasn't being used enough and that it was seemed experimental to them. Right? I like to tease Bert that if he just had a better map, what he was really missing that first application was he just didn't have a good map. That would have made all the difference. So Bert Went about his way. He didn't take it too hard, I don't think. He eventually retired. He started running the Snow Goose. Some of you know the Snow Goose there that Bert used to run trips up back and forth up to the southeast Alaska. And I think he more or less put that good idea on the shelf. And a funny thing happened while Bert was off traipsing around to Alaska and back is that the name actually caught on by itself. And specifically, it was being adopted and used by resource managers, both indigenous, state, provincial, by scientists, and by increasingly locals, the boating community. I mean, I first came across the term just as a sailor out in the San Juans in the probably early 2000s. And it seemed like a great name. Like, yeah, well, why wouldn't we? What a good idea. So 2000, so years go by, and a number of things happen. People keep suggesting, Bert, you ought to try that again. There was also this adoption by the indigenous peoples, the Coast Salish peoples, the Coast Salish gathering. They saw they shared the desire. They saw the risk and the power of a name. I think that we're happy to adopt that. They liked the association of the word Salish there. As I said, it was somewhat politically correct in all ways. And so with the support of the indigenous communities and a bunch of scientists, there was a more concerted, a broader effort, a campaign, and a reapplication in 2008. And so with that reapplication, there was a desire to document. The first thing was to document the usage. That's what you have to do to apply. But beyond that, they also wanted to promote further use. And there was an effort to overcome the resistance. And so there were some lessons learned there, both from the 1988 application, but also from the Denali and Haida Gwaii and some of the other naming processes that had happened. And so a more strategic application, as it were, was made in 2008. And that's where I came in. So as I said, there was resistance to the name, the idea, and that came down into a couple different categories. One was that it was going to replace the names. So people were very attached to the idea that, I live in the Puget Sound watershed, or I live in the San Juan Islands, and I don't want to lose that. And so Bert came knocking on my door. His first was, he said he needed a map. He wanted a map that didn't have a line right through the middle of his ecosystem. And that seemed simple enough and a reasonable enough request. As we started making that map, though, it served the campaign in a variety of ways. And as I said, there had been resistance to Denali. It took decades to get Denali approved. Haida Gwaii similarly, and those were both renamings, and so they are much more controversial. And so that was the first pushback to the idea of the Salish Sea. So when Bert first asked for a map, he had the idea at one point of a map that had no text on it at all. He just wanted to see the natural, the water, the shoreline, the rivers and trees, what have you. Didn't want any cities, no roads, no railroads, airports, right? And again, as I said, maybe even no text. And I argued that the text, as a cartographer also, the text was important. I wanted something in there to hang on, but it also was very important for that campaign. So the map served as both here's a map, an educational, here's the Salish Sea, you can see where it is, but also part of this effort. And so it was very important to have right there on the map, that the Strait of Georgia, Strait of Juan de Fuca, Gulf Islands, San Juan Islands, Puget Sound, Desolation Sound, it's on the map. You don't worry. Right there under the name Salish Sea, you still have those local place names that we're all attached to. And so that was, just don't worry. There was also pushback from the standpoint of this is unnecessary and we don't need it and it's going to be expensive and you have to update every map. Every map would be wrong. To which we said, maps get updated all the time. The world is a changeable place and there's not a single map out there that's not out of date. They are instantly out of date. And so as they get remade, and again, the old maps weren't wrong because it's still Puget Sound. It's just new information being applied. And there are lots of names. There was a lot of, we don't need it because kind of arguments against it. It's always been the way it was, which is of course kind of comical. There's nothing wrong with the Puget Sound, which we agree with. It's a good name. There were actually a number of other names over the years that have been proposed. Way back into the 1800s, Captain Vancouver came through. The whole water was named the Gulf of Georgia. All right, so that entire inland sea had a name. And personally, I think the Gulf of Georgia is a pretty nice name for that water. It also happens to have the alliteration of Gulf of Georgia, like Salish Sea has the S's. Um, I think it's unlikely to ever be approved at this point because so much of the population of humans, the deciding making humans down in Seattle, I think would have just resistance to that. That, it sounds too much like the Strait of Georgia, which sounds too much like Canada. And by gosh, we live in the Puget Sound down here, and we don't want to, that seemed, I think, threatening. It was also referred to as the Georgia Depression sometime, and that seems a little less cheery than we would like. There was a proposal in the 50s to call the whole inland waters the Western Sea, and I haven't had much luck finding who was making that proposal or why, but it's not a bad name for the area. More commonly, there were efforts to refer to it as the Greater Puget Sound, which is offensive in a number of ways. So Puget Sound is a very clearly defined geographic body of water. It ends at Admiralty Inlet right there at Port Townsend. It does not include the San Juan Islands. It does not include the Strait of Georgia or Strait of Juan de Fuca. In fact, when the Puget Sound was first named, it was just the area short south of the Tacoma Narrows, right? So Burt refers to this as Puget Creep, that the Puget Sound started off as a small body of water, and then it expanded into a medium-sized body of water. And then there was this effort to move on to the whole area. And if, personally, I find this offensive. And, if the Salish Sea naming adoption, I'm happy it happened if for no other reason than it seems to have stopped the Puget Sound creep and keeps Puget Sound as the defined body of water that it should be. Now and Puget Sound, by the way, is only 14% of the Salish Sea. So it's not, even though it has most of the people, it's not like it's the dominant water of the area. Nothing compared to the Gulf of Strait of Georgia or Strait of Juan de Fuca. So more commonly, the most frequently used in recent decades was Georgia Basin Puget Sound. A bit of an oxymoron because a Georgia Basin, that's the land, and Puget Sound is water. So you've got an apples and orange things going on there. It also omits the Strait of Juan de Fuca, so it's not really incorporating the full area that we want. The Georgia Puget Basin. There was a proposal back in the 80s, the Ish River Sound. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But the best description we had was the Strait of Georgia, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the Puget Sound, and Desolation Sound, which is a little bit awkward to say. And again, Georgia Basin Puget Sound was sort of the lead horse of the day. So we countered that yes, there actually there were a lot of names, but clearly there was a need for an overall name, and there had been efforts made and unsuccessful, but that they spoke to the need. The final resistance that we encountered was the belief that the Salish Sea didn't really qualify as a sea. It wasn't big enough, or it had two outlets, it had too many straits, what have you. So as a good geographer, I went off and started researching seas, trying to get a definition of what is a sea, and was the Salish Sea big enough? Should it have been the Salish Bay or the Salish Fjord or the Salish Sound? It turns out there's a huge variation in what constitutes a sea out there, from as small as 5,000 square kilometers to 5 million. There are inland seas, there are freshwater seas, there are, sometimes the British Channel is referred to as the British Sea. It's all over the map, so to speak. The Salish Sea, again, is 17,000 or so square kilometers. Lake Ontario is only 19. So it's the smaller of the lakes. It's bigger than the Salish Sea. Chesapeake Bay, on the other hand, the largest bay in the United States, is 11,000. So that makes sense that a Salish Sea is bigger than a bay, a sea being bigger than a bay. On the other hand, Hudson's Bay is 1.2 million square kilometers. It's often referred to as an inland sea. So what we learn from all this is that it's not easy. There's not a clear definition. Go to the dictionary, no help there. That you get things like a tract of water within an ocean. Well, that could apply to a lot of things, like a strait or a channel, what have you. A body of water of second rank. Well, what's second rank? All these comparatively, partially enclosed, relatively large, a lot of kind of squishy terms in there, and a lot of overlap with seas and bays and channels and straits. And so the analysis, the conclusion from all this research that I did was that there is no definition for a sea, and the answer to what is a sea is things that have the word sea in their name. All right, and that sounds like kind of a smart aleck answer, but it's actually not. And it goes back to those geographic naming boards. That the bottom line is things that we call a sea. That's what a sea is, right? And the Salish Sea certainly qualifies, or at the very least, it can't be disqualified. There's plenty of other examples of things that are bigger, smaller, more outlets, less outlets, that are adopted as the name sea that get that stamp of approval. So that felt good. And I made a series of maps at the time trying to help show that. Uh, it also kind of underscores, again, back to the power of the map of, who gets to decide. Well, if there's a map, Bert didn't have in the 80s, but if you had a map that says Sailor Sea, it sort of looks mighty official, doesn't it? So what is a sea? What is an island? You'd think that'd be pretty, islands, that's easy to define. It's a body of land surrounded by water. But again, as you start pushing on that one very far, how big of a rock do you need to be an island, and at what tide? High tide, low tide, mean tide? Does it have to have a name to be an island? Does it have to be populated or vegetated? What about those mud flats? So here's the Nooksack River Delta. Those islands, they're in the salt water, kind of. They change with tide and with storm. How many of those do you count, or do you count any at all? What about Fidalgo? So to my surprise, when someone asks how many islands are in the Salish Sea, I thought, well, I'll just go find out what the definition from Washington State is for an island, and then I'll apply that to and Washington State doesn't really have a definition. It's more like we call islands things that we call islands. Rivers, the same way. And so different parts of the world, does it have to have fish? Does it have to be perennial? Does it have to have flow year round? Does it have to be a certain kind of flow? What's a river versus a creek? It was wonderfully and annoyingly vague in so many ways. And so sitting down to make this map, I start with birds like, well, we don't know what a sea is, what an island is, or a river. What we do have is counties and states and countries and roads and some elevation data. Except for Bert didn't want most of that on the map. The first thing he was like, no, I don't want the border. I don't even want roads or cities or counties. I don't want any of that. I want to keep the focus on the water and, to a lesser extent, the land surrounding the Salish Sea. That's what's important to this map. So that brings up the question of, what is a map? Very briefly, a map is a two-dimensional, so we're talking about flat depiction of some portion of the Earth. And more importantly, maps have a purpose and an audience. That every map that someone goes to the trouble of making this, they have something in mind, somebody and a reason for making this map. So the map here, this is a 1958 Black Ball Ferry. They were trying to sell ferry routes. It's interesting to me because it's the oldest map that I found that had Bert's extent, right? So there's the Salish Sea, pretty much the same border, extent of water. Clearly not a good map from his standpoint because it's got too much human footprint on it and too many green lines of ferry routes and, of course, a border through the middle of it. But at least there was, that's sort of where it was going. So, and it illustrates that every map has a purpose. Bert's map, the one he wanted me to make for him, what was his purpose? Our purpose was to show the Salish Sea without a line through that ecosystem, no roads or place names, just focusing on the ecosystem, the terrain, and if we could get the bathymetry, so bathymetry being the shape, the sea floor. So if you look at the Black Ball Ferry map, the water is just flat green. You see that it's not land, but you don't get any sense of the terrain of the seafloor. So that would be great if we could get that. We could use this map both to describe where the Salish Sea is and to promote the usage. And so that's a somewhat unusual map because all these things that you normally would want to have on a map, Bert didn't want on the map. And again, there's lots of maps out there. Most of them stop at the border. Most of them have human roads and footprints. And what Bert wanted was a sort of odd thing. It's not a Google map. It's not a NOAA chart. It's not a USGS topo map. And he'd been looking, right? He didn't come knocking on my door first. He went looking for a map and thought that'd be pretty easy. I'll just go find a map of the Salish Sea. And that wasn't easy at all. Even as you get into climactic zones and some of the watershed boundaries, most of those maps stop at the border. Even worse, some of them draw a border right through the middle of his ecosystem, as though climactic zones stopped at the border, right? There was a few maps out there more of a continental scale, but at that point, well, first of all, you still have a border going through them, but you also, the Salish Sea is just this little puddle, right? So the scale was all wrong. And so you wanted to focus on what you wanted to focus on. So there was a few other attempts. Again, the common label used for this inland waters area was the Georgia Basin, Puget Sound in the 80s, 90s. And there had been a few efforts at making maps. Notable, they still have the border going right through them. Notable, they still have a human footprint of some of the cities and whatnot. and that the water is, again, from Bert's standpoint, kind of boring. It's almost like an afterthought to the map. Bert wanted a map that showed the Salish Sea, that defined his waters, that showed off how beautiful this place was, without a line right through the middle. And my response to him when he first knocked on my door was, "This is great. I love the idea." And that was my job. One of my jobs as Huxley College is to make maps for faculty or faculty emeritus, as Bert was at the time, to support their research and whatever. So it was great. I ended up spending a lot of, far more hours than I thought, a lot of weekends and evenings trying, because it consumed me for a while. Because I said to Bert, look, if we're going to make this map, if you're going to be handing this out, I mean, the map there, that would work, but let's make it beautiful. Let's make it something that people want to hang on their wall. They want to, put in their classrooms. Let's make this, essentially a piece of propaganda, which all maps are. All maps have a purpose. But let's make this purpose not just be, here's the Salish Sea, define it, but it'd be an outreach effort to getting people to love the Salish Sea, which is, again, that the whole point of the name was, we want people to feel invested in the Salish Sea as a place that's worthy of protection and transcends this annoying border through the middle. So how are we going to do that? One idea was to look at satellite imagery, air photos. There were some maps out there that are sort of similar to this area. They still have a lot of human footprint on them and a border down the middle. Even if you get air photos, this is sort of a mock-up I did where you take that off. It turns out that the human footprint, even from space, is amazingly obnoxious from Bert's standpoint, from our standpoint. You really see how much humans have changed the surface, especially in the lowlands, especially near those estuaries. One idea I've kicked around for years is, wouldn't it be a Photoshop project where you replaced all those human city development area, and you put in instead virgin timber and forests and trees, and you make a pre-Euro contact satellite, quote unquote, esque imagery piece of work. There also have been numerous attempts at blending and acknowledging indigenous peoples, languages, areas, hunting and fishing grounds, etc. Bunch of great ideas. Some of them still in process, some of them being worked on. It wasn't really Bert's map. That wasn't the point of that map that we were making. Partly because it still focuses, mostly those people are spending most of their time on the land. They often become more of land place names, even though they were very much maritime cultures. There are also a few different sort of more artistic renditions. This is in 1867. I love this map of Puget Sound, a more recent by Elizabeth Pearson, artist down near Seattle. And one can do the similar things with watercolors and fills with the current. I think this was all a little too artsy for Bert. I mean, Bert's a scientist, and let's keep it. Again, he wanted it to look and feel kind of like what it really is, without going to the air photo had problems, but in some ways the air photo, that just capturing what's on the ground in terms of trees and whatnot, would have been what he would have wanted if we could have. So what's our purpose? Promote, define, who's our audience? Locals, the naming boards. What do we want to put on there? Water and land, pretty much. And we want to capture the feel, but no footprint. And we fast forward just a few months later of my time, and this is what we got. Salish Sea and surrounding basin, a map defining and showcasing this body of water that Bert and I felt worthy of protecting. So looking at that, so I'm a GIS guy, GIS, Geographic Information System. So I did this whole map in the lab, at the desk on the computer. I didn't go out in the world at all. I was able to use publicly available data, and pretty much the map contains 4 different data categories. They break down into more like 30 different layers in the computer, but fundamentally I had land, saltwater, freshwater, and then this basin boundary. And I'll talk about all those a little bit more. From a terrain standpoint, I've just got elevation, and I've chosen this a graduated series of colors with darker greens down in the lowlands, and then the brighter greens and the tans up high, and the whites, trying to mimic what it feels like to be up in the Cascade Mountain Range, right? I've applied a hill shade effect. That's this sort of shadowy overlay that gives the sense kind of like a 3D terrain map. And then a similar thing for the bathymetry. Again, the bathymetry is the terrain if you drained the water out of this Salish Sea, and then a similar shadowing effect of a floor shade, all right, the sea floor shade, like a hill shade. and the shoreline. So that gives that sort of a sense of the ruggedness of that terrain and the depth of the water. From a freshwater standpoint, the lakes and the streams are kind of bright colors because they're not that big on the terrain, and I wanted them to pop out a little bit. And there's a little bit of this what's called a sun glint or a highlight on the lakes to kind of give them a little bit of texture so they're not just flat. And then there's this ridge line that surrounds almost the watershed, the basin boundary, which I'll talk about more in a second. And beyond that basin, that ridge line, this sort of semi-transparent, so that yes, there's world out there beyond the ridge, on the other side of the ridge from the Salish Sea, but right now we're focusing our attention. So clearly, you know, what's the brightest color in the map? The Salish Sea. It's in the center of the map. You know, it's the highlight. It's what we're talking about, right? So basic graphic rules of design and attention grabbing. So let's talk about watersheds for a moment versus a basin boundary. So this map, this has the full watershed that drains into the Salish Sea. Watershed's a little bit odd. So watershed is the uphill area that, you know, right, that drains to a point. It's a little bit odd to talk about a watershed for a marine body, right? Because effectively Japan drains into the Salish Sea also. So what we do for a marine body of water is we look at all the rivers that drain into that body of water. So if you're talking about the Salish Sea or the Strait of Georgia or what have you, any creek or river that drains into it, you look at the watersheds for those constituent pieces. Okay, so that works pretty well. Here's that pink line there is the boundary that we used, and it's pretty much a watershed line in all cases except for where the Fraser River comes shooting right through the middle of our basin boundary, and so that's a clear violation of a watershed definition. And so we were very careful to not ever say that this is a map of the watershed. All right, it's a basin boundary. So that was done because otherwise the page size, the Salish Sea gets too small. We wanted to focus the attention. You know, this is, again, this map has a purpose. So you can talk about the watershed for the entire Fraser River. So that's it there, highlighted in color. You can talk about subsets. You can pull off one of the tribs like the Thompson River up there, and you can talk about just a smaller upper section. But you cannot define the watershed for the lower section of a river. It just doesn't make logical sense. That's not how watershed works. All that water from the upper Fraser drains through. It's part of the watershed of the Salish Sea, and there's no other way of cutting that. So that wasn't what we wanted, though. And so we ended up with this term basin boundary. It's not a watershed, though it follows the same line, and we were careful to label that on the map as basin boundary, not watershed. So what is a basin? Well, a basin is a bowl-shaped depression in the land or the ocean. It's a hollow. It's a collection of watersheds. There's a variety of terms. It's much fuzzier, squishier, less well-defined than watershed, and we use that to our advantage consciously. It gets used for things like a weather basin or a cultural basin for an area of influence around often a large metropolitan area. But that idea of a cultural basin, I latched onto myself, and that, yeah, that's what we're talking about. It's not just the hydrology. We're talking about the area around there. And we talked about other terms of catchment or drainage or region. You know, region's too vague. Bowl sounds like cereal. You know, the basin boundary seemed like it worked for us. And there was also a historical precedent that if you remember that Georgia Basin Puget Sound map from 2003, there's a very similar basin boundary, which they're referring to as their basin boundary, and which also violates that same watershed problem. All right, so they're also cutting off the whole upper watershed of the Fraser River. So we came up to this cultural hydrological demarcation of the area influenced by and influencing the Salish Sea, more or less the area within sight of the sea too. So if you walk that ridge line, you can kind of imagine seeing the water from there, but not really from the other side of there. And again, it is the watershed in everywhere except for the Fraser River, and of course where it meets the ocean. So briefly then, making the map, as I said, very little text. The only text really are the geographic features, the major mountains, the major rivers. Who defines major? The cartographer does. And then the cartographic elements of the tidal and the north arrow and the scale bar and stuff like that. We're going for a kind of a classic feel, these room lines radiating out at the cardinal directions, trying to kind of feel like an old, mixed with a new technology of this, the hillshade and what's called a Swiss hillshade and the sun glints and the modern data. So a mixture of old and new that hopefully captured people's attention. Fairly quickly, we started handing those out, and we realized that we wanted to tell, again, as a story, we put this backside on there, so you can download the map, and if you do, I encourage you to download the backside as well and print them both. So you've got, it's a very abbreviated version of this story here. But Bert went out and he printed literally thousands of these maps, and he handed them out to schools and government officials and conferences and basically anybody on the street who would take them. The Coast Salish Gathering as well. There were hundreds and hundreds of downloads. They're still being downloaded, and lo and behold, it worked. It was a success. In 0708, the Coast Salish peoples, the Coast Salish Gathering, adopted the name. In 09, Canada, WA, and USA, and then 2010, BC, all kind of, whatever. Formally adopting the name Salish Sea as that place where we are right now, most of us. 2009, it was the name of the year. That was a big deal. We beat out Twitter. We thought that was pretty good. 2008 was Obama as the name of the year, so we felt like we were in good company. We showed up on Google. That was a big deal. Like, oh, okay, now we've really made it. But we also showed up on whale watching tours and record albums, books, the Salish Sea Institute, what had been the Georgia Basin Puget Sound Ecosystem Conference, renamed as Salish Sea Ecosystem Conference. So the name worked. It is working. It is everywhere out there. And likewise, the map shows up all over the place in posters and websites. And turns out if you make your map free, free is a pretty good price, pretty popular with people. I want to super quickly mention the Ish River map. This was after I'd made my map, Bert was out there. Actually, the name had been approved. I stumbled across in the Huxley Map Library the Ish River country, done in 1987. The exact same time Bert was having this, another crew, David McCloskey et al., had this idea of the Ish River. And if you look at that boundary, again, the same omitting of the Upper Fraser, same focusing on the water draining into the Salish Sea. Now, David and company, they were concerned about the rivers, not the sea. They sometimes referred to it as Ish River Sound, but really they were more terrestrial. More recently, I had the good fortune to meet him, and he's working on a revision of the map that includes the Salish Sea. So if we had the Salish Sea, there's a complementary that he's looking at the upland, the Ish River being the Snohomish, the Stillaguamish, the Duwamish, all these Ish rivers. So he's working on a revised that map of still the Ish rivers, but with the Salish Sea as well. And maybe that would have worked, won out, but it didn't. What won out, what got the approval of the jurisdictions involved is not Ish River, it's not Western Sound, it's not our sea, it's not the Greater Georgia Basin, it's the Salish Sea, which is now where we all live. There's of course more work to be done. Could read it with better data, could the indigenous place names on top of that. An effort to do a series of maps. Dr. Aquila Flower et al. Has been working on a Salish Sea Atlas and a database of trans-border is a problem. So that work is ongoing. There's also, I can give links for, she's done some talks on that as well, some great work. And then so there's sort of her version of my map, which is great. And meanwhile, the map, I haven't gotten around to redoing it, but it's still out there. I get emails all the time. You're welcome to download it there from maps.stephenfreeland.com. It has stood this test of time to my great pleasure. I walk into, restaurants or whatever, lawyer's office. I went to a lawyer, and hanging on the wall in the lawyer's office is my map of the Salish Sea, and it's been an honor to have coattailed I feel like I coattailed with Bert on his effort at this naming of the Salish Sea. Okay, so probably talked more than I should have, but there's still a little bit of time for questions if people have questions. Hi, cats. You're muted. You got to unmute. I don't think I can unmute you.
Hi, sorry. Okay.
Hi, cats.
Hello. Hi, everyone. So one of the questions we have here is, it was regarding a slide that showed estuary loss. And the question is the slide showing estuary loss, are the red areas projected or hypothetical sea level rise or something else?
So that was a 2019 study, and it was done for the whole west coast of the U.S. And so the red dots there, those are just highlighting those red dots corresponded with the bar chart. So those are areas like the Nooksack River Delta, like the Samish River Delta, and that they could then give more discussion. And I've got that link if people want to look for there. So, but they were not looking particularly at sea level rise hasn't happened. They were just doing, this is compared to what there would have been, what they could measure in 2019. And so at that point, we had only 15% less left. of what would have been the pre-Euro contact estuaries for Washington State. And it was similar for Europe or for Oregon and California, different numbers and whatever. So it's amazing to think about. We like to live. That's where the good fishing is. That's where the good access to the water, good farming. We've done a lot of stuff with that lowland area. It's a nice place to live, but we've lost a lot. Yeah.
Another question we have here is, why was the Queen Charlotte Strait not included with the Salish Sea?
Yeah, so almost all of the what flushing of water into the Salish Sea is coming through that Strait of Juan de Fuca. Johnstone Strait, even though the water rushes through there, really, if you've been through there, it's pretty dramatic. But in terms of the impact on the Salish Sea, much less, minuscule. And as you go further into north into the Gulf Islands, the water gets warmer because it's not flushing as much in the summer. It's good swimming up there if you want to go up there, and the salt, the salination changes, and some of the species change. So I think that was Bert, as far as I know, Bert, drawing lines on a map, those that claim the name. But I think it was really, he was looking at, again, influence. And so that's a really different influence area. And that north of Johnstone Strait is being influenced from the Charlottes. It really is from Hatigua, from that northern access of the salt water coming in there. Yes, they cross, but not as much as you would think from a marine biologist standpoint. Yeah.
All right. Does the term Salish still see much use throughout Idaho, Montana, or Oregon?
Yeah, I think so. I think, again, it's this larger umbrella linguistic. And so I think the people that are studying language, it's still a relative term. I mean, the Coast Salish was a subset of that. So, that's a demarcation more locally. I'm not, I guess, able to answer that with any great authority, but my sense is that yes, it's still a relatively, you can look up, Salish. And there's various, I haven't found a clear, concise answer in terms of where that first word came from. And there's various theories of what Salish might have been being named after or meaning when it was first adopted.
Now that you've had some time from the map's creation and its use, is there anything that you would change about the map?
Well, I mean, the biggest issue, when I think about redoing it, basically the size 11 by 17, that was good for printing, good for distributing, affordable. It also was about as big of a map as I could make, given the data I had available. And so if you take that map and you print it as people often are saying, hey, can I get a poster size of that, 3 by 4 feet? And the data just doesn't look very good. It's the resolution, especially of the bathymetry. It looks grainy. And so what I would most love to do is there's better data now, 12 years later, would be to redo the map with better bathymetry, better elevation, a map that could be printed as a wall-size poster. There was other things, like I sort of wanted to put in more of those estuaries, the tide flats, as a sort of a brown color. That's a harder data layer to get your hands on, and so it'd be a lot of work to get those in there for what you'd barely see because they're small. But sure, there's those would be the main things I would love to. And then numerous people have asked about doing an overlay, like the indigenous place names, like some of the things like that. There was a trails group that, with my permission, added a proposed marine trail on top of it. And so there's some other ideas like that I think would be great as sort of using it as a base. So people put Vancouver or Seattle on it all the time, and I see on websites like, well, that's not really. It wasn't what you're supposed to do, but that's okay.
And we have a student had a question. How did you get interested in GIS?
Yeah, so I was a Huxley Fairhaven student looking at environmental ethics, and then I went out there and got a job as a carpenter because it turns out there weren't a lot of jobs telling people how to live simply. And carpentry led me to design, AutoCAD, and I was thinking about being a draftsperson. and from there stumbled into the idea of GIS. I had never even heard of it, and it was just, it was drafting only with maps, and I loved maps, and so promptly raced back to grad school here at Western Huxley. Got a master's in geography GIS, and so it was fortuitous for me that Western had that program, and then did a series of GIS analyst kind of jobs before I came back to Western. So I feel like I've been around Western for a long time in one capacity or another. But the mapping and the ability, as someone who's not super artistic, I've never with pen and ink. So the ability to make something beautiful on a computer was very exciting to me. I have friends who were cartographers who retired when GIS came in, because they were doing USGS maps by hand, very artistic, and they were like, they had wanted to have nothing to do with the computers, and so they went off and got other jobs. And for me, it was just the opposite. That the GIS gave me an entry point to maps, which is what the computer, which I thought I loved. So that's great.
All right. I think that's what we have in terms of questions.
Great.
And it looks like we're right at time.
Yeah, good time. So, and I will add some links to the event page of some of those other talks if people are interested. You're welcome to email me, stefan@ww.edu. And then shifting gears into my other hat, next week we've got Kurt Grinnell from Northwest Indian Fisheries. So he'll be talking to us. And 2 weeks, again, Catherine Sobocinski talking about the state of the Salish Sea report. So more good talks to come. Thanks, Cats. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.